Hi, I'm Isabel Buckley, the artist behind Izzy's art, and today I wanted to share with you this drawing, which is based on a photograph I took of some blossom on one of my lunchtime walks. I kept passing this tree and loved how beautiful it looked in bloom, and was inspired to have a go at drawing it. For this one, I decided to use oil pastels and coloured pencils on Canson Mitenity's dark grey paper. This is the first time I've used this paper, and I have to say I absolutely love it. It comes with two different sides. One is more textured with a honeycomb effect, and the other is smoother. For this project, I've used the smoother side. If you would like to have a go at doing this yourself, then I've added the details of where you can get my reference photo and outline ready for you to have a go, along with the list of materials that I've used. The oil pastels I've used are Caran d'Ache Neo Pastels, and the coloured pencils are mostly Caran d'Ache Luminance with a couple of others. This was a bit of an experimental piece for me, and I will share with you some of my tips and findings as I explain my approach. I also discovered a couple of very useful tools called colour shapers. I've used the dark grey extra firm ones. I have a cup round size 6 and a flat chisel size 2. One of the key things I've learnt in this process is that when laying down the initial oil pastels as a base layer, you want to do so with a light hand. If you put too much oil pastel down, you will just end up scraping it off with the coloured pencils. When drawing the petals, I started by applying a layer of white oil pastel, then some granite rose in the non-white areas, followed by a little pink in the pinker areas. You will see that because of the slight texture of the paper, I have not completely covered it as I'm not pressing very hard. Once I did this, I then used my cup round colour shaper to blend the oil pastels together to create a base layer for the coloured pencils. I used the coloured pencils to add in more detail and elements of colour over the initial base layers of the pastel. I started with my lighter colours, some apricot luminance, which is a warm pinky orange colour, and then some pink madder polychromas, which is a wonderful vibrant pink. I then worked on the shadow areas with some sepia 10% luminance. I reapplied bits of oil pastel over the top where needed, particularly the white, and blended them in before reapplying the same coloured pencils until I was happy with the effect. As I worked through the petals and became more familiar with mixing these two mediums, I generally did a layer of oil pastels, then coloured pencils, and then repeated this process, with a few tweaks of course. I also incorporated a few other tones into some of the petals, such as ultramarine violet and steel grey luminance. When I wanted to get those few bits of darker pink in, I used just a hint of purple oil pastel, which is a pinky purple colour, and then used my colour shaper to blend it in. Working on a dark paper can often have its own challenges to achieve light, white or brighter tones. By applying an initial layer of white oil pastels, it gave a lighter base to work on in those areas. You may be wondering then why use a toned paper? Well, there are several reasons. Firstly, if using a white paper, you can't see if you put down a white base layer very well, and I wanted a white base layer to soften the subsequent colours as the petals are very soft in tone. Also, by using a dark tone paper, I could use this to my advantage when creating the darker toned areas. If you only use a very light layer of pastel, then the darker tones of the paper show through. So when applying the coloured pencils, I didn't have to work so hard to achieve the darker tones, as the dark undertone of the paper changes the appearance of the coloured pencil. I found the easiest way of approaching this picture was to work on one petal at a time rather than a whole flower. This made it easier not to put my hand on top of the oil pastels and smudge them, and also I found it made it more manageable to work in smaller sections. If you do this rather than working on large areas or a whole picture at once, just be sure to keep a note of your process and colours used so that you have consistency across areas, or in this example, the whole flower or flowers. Once I had worked up most of the petals around the middle of the flower, I then put in the centre. I started with some white oil pastel in the lighter areas, particularly where the petals were showing through, and a little ash grey as they are darker there because of the shadow. I then blended it to get the base layer. I then used some yellow oil pastel to plot in the anthers, followed by some orange oil pastel. And then to shape them a little and add a little tone, I used the Apricot Luminance pencil, which I'd used before. Using the same colour gives some unity across the whole flower that way. For the yellowy green elements, I used an olive yellow luminance pencil, and for the darker lines on the anther, I used some natural russet luminance. For the leaves, I used some yellow-green oil pastel as a base layer, with some emerald green in the darker areas and some light olive to give a variation of greens. I also added a touch of white in the lightest places where the sun was hitting the leaf, before blending them together with a colour shape cup round tool. For some detail, I used a moss green and a green ochre luminance, followed by some more layers of pastel and coloured pencil, including a dark green whose name you will have to forgive me if I don't pronounce quite right. It is a dark phallocyanine green, and I used this in the darkest areas. I also added a little light cobalt blue where the sun was hitting the leaf. I played around with the balance of oil pastels and coloured pencils until I was happy with the result, as I didn't want too much detail, as I wanted to save that for the flowers, but I wanted them to look like leaves. For the darker leaves in the drawing, I also used some dark green, black, brown and khaki green oil pastels to really build up those dark undertones. The beauty with the oil pastels is that you can add light over dark. I continued to build up the petals on the flowers using the same process and colours as before. On the petals that are pinker, I used more pink oil pastel in the base layers, and on the petals that were more in shadow, I also used some ultramarine violet, which works very well with the dark grey paper to get those purpley grey shadows. If you enjoy watching the rest of this time-lapse video and would like to learn more about drawing the petals, then there is a real-time video with me explaining my process so that you can follow along. you have enjoyed this little video and found it helpful. Don't forget you can get a copy of my reference photo and an outline of it ready for you to have a go if you fancy it. I'll pop the information below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, I'd be delighted for you to leave a comment and to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.